So in section one, we start with introducing what statistics is. And I think we got a pretty good understanding of that with our first class meetings, whether my traditional class or my hybrid class. But there are two different uses of the word statistics, one uppercase, one lowercase. So we're going to break down the difference. The uppercase statistics is the art and science of using data to understand the world around us. This is exactly what we were doing in class. We were collecting data to see what time people woke up on Sunday, or simulating data to see whether or not Joy could smell Parkinson's. So we were doing the uppercase statistics. Now, there are two types of statistics that we'll be looking at this semester. Descriptive stats, this is just organizing your data, presenting it, displaying it. You can think of this as the dot plot we did when we did the smelling Parkinson's activity, or the actual data set we made in the what time did everyone wake up on Sunday. So descriptive stats is what we're going to be playing a lot with when we get to part 2 of the lecture notes, and we'll see it a little bit also in part 3. The second half of the semester, we're going to be focusing on inferential statistics. And again, we did this in both of those activities. We used some data to make a prediction, usually about a population, but sometimes about some other variable we don't have within our data set. So this is inferential statistics, drawing conclusions or making predictions based on incomplete data. And we'll be seeing this when we get to we'll see a little bit in part 3, but we'll also see it in everything after part 6, including part 6. So if you're keeping track, you're probably going, well, what the heck happened with parts 4 and 5 of your lecture notes, especially because I haven't posted them up yet and you have no idea what they are. Part 4 and 5 are the mathematical underpinnings that we need in order to do all of the statistics in 6+. So this is where I said the course gets mathy, right? The first exam is going to cover parts 1, 2, and 3, which is a lot of descriptive stats, stuff you probably already know, but we're going to keep adding on to that with some more understanding. And then that's, as I said, exam 2 becomes very mathy because we're over here in math land figuring out probabilities and probability distributions that we're going to use together with our understanding from parts 1, 2, and 3 in part 6. So just wanted to throw that out there. We have two types of stats for right now. We're in descriptive stats land, and that's where we're moving in part 2. Lowercase statistics is data or actual values from our sample. So when you guys took your samples of the number of shirts you smelled and you found that your number correct was 7 or whatever the heck your number was, that was a statistic. If you went ahead and figured out the proportion that were correct instead of the number, right? I'll call that proportion, and divided it by the 12. That's still another statistic. So the statistic is just a summary of the data that we got. And then we also talked in class about statistics in real life. I'll just quickly give us some examples of how these different fields might use statistics. I choose these because usually I have a lot of business, nursing majors in class, and then all of us should be interested in education because we're in school, and sports is usually an easy one to get people interested in as well. So in business, statistics is traditionally used most for something like marketing, right? Trying to figure out what markets to actually advertise to, figure out who their actual client base is, seeing if a marketing scheme is actually effective. All potential uses in business, and that's not all. You could do this also to look at supply and demand, like how much do we need, forecasting, how much product you need to have for particular times. Medicine, probably the most common way we think of this within medicine is drug trials, determining whether or not a new method or medicine is going to be effective. In education, this is used all the time. We like to evaluate initiatives to see if they are actually worth the amount of time and money that is going into them. So we can see that here at Mesa with something like the CT program. We are able to have classroom tutors in our classes because there's been a lot of research done to show that classes with classroom tutors tend to perform much better than those classes without classroom tutors. Now, of course, there's some issues there, and we'll talk about that bias when we get to that section of these lecture notes. Another way that we see this used a lot is in the scheduling. There's a whole enrollment management process and work group, trying to figure out how many courses do we need of each particular subject and each particular level, trying to make sure that we don't have students unable to get the classes they need. Obviously, there are limitations like classrooms and instructors, but we try our hardest to make sure every student can get into the classes they need. And then also stuff like placement. So the new push by the state to eliminate basic skills and say we can't place students anything below Algebra 2 is based on statistics. There are statistics that show only, I think it's like 7% of students, if they're placed at pre-algebra, will ever make it all the way through transfer math. So, but they've shown you could take those same students, throw them directly into transfer math, specifically into a stats class, and the success rate is much higher. It's around 50%. And maybe not the first time, but better than having them go what we have here, 38 to 46 to 96 to 119. Thankfully, we eventually had 92, but even that process was still too much, and a lot of students didn't make it through. And then in sports, we've got things like, oh no, I want to keep with red. Things like Moneyball, if you have seen that movie or read that book, the idea of choosing and recruiting players based on their potential and looking at the statistics behind them. For those of us who are playing fantasy football, a lot of stats in that. I want to see how many points the player is going to get us. And then there's always those sort of non sequitur things they throw out during games that are just insane. There's a lot of statistics used in sports. We got one more thing to talk about, I think. I don't know. I'm scrolling down with you, so we'll see. Before we get to the next section, and that is the statistical process. So I'm going to try to refer back to this throughout the course, but the way we tend to teach stats, and one day maybe I'll revise all of my stuff for the 1000th time to change it, but the way we teach stats is everything is kind of compartmentalized. We're going to learn about study design. And then we're going to learn about the descriptive stats. And then we're going to learn about our inferential statistics. And then we're going to go ahead and make some conclusions, which again, we'll talk about in part 6 and part 7. And then we'll go back and sort of reinform all of that. But as you can see, it's sort of segmented the way we do it in stats class, as opposed to looking at all of this together. But this is what I'm going to ask you to do in your research project. Start with a research question. Design what your study is going to be. What data are you going to collect? And I'm going to help you here. I'm your consultant. You're going to collect your data. You're going to analyze it. And then you're going to give us your conclusions and what future work you would do, what new questions you would have now that you've seen all of this. So this is at the heart of everything we do in this class, and I'm going to try my hardest to make sure I constantly refer back to it, even though we're going to be kind of within little pieces of it. All right, so, oh yes, I gave an example here from the New York Times. There was an article where they had actually messed with students and assigned students meal plans with different, not students, prisoners. Seems the same sometimes. Prisoners, meal plans with different sodium levels. So they wanted to know, how does salt impact health? Now, what we're going to learn is that there's two ways to do a study. One is to just go out and ask people how much salt is in your diet. And the other is to actually ask people to eat a certain amount of salt. Now, it is very hard to come to any sort of meaningful causal relationship or conclusion when you're doing the first type of study, when you're just going out and asking people how much salt is in your diet. Because those of us who pour a ton of salt onto our food, I'm putting myself in that category, are probably less healthy eaters than those that don't. And I do love French fries, so I'll put myself in that category as well. So we're not necessarily seeing if salt is the reason that the health is worse, or if it's just that that person cares less about healthy eating than someone who doesn't put a lot of salt on their food. So one way to deal with that, the best way to deal with that, is to have an experiment. Randomly assign people certain salt levels, and that's what they did. Now, the data collections here, they would go ahead and do, but I want you to think about how the rest of that would play out. If this is actually approved and funded, they would go ahead, they would assign people into different groups, high salt, low salt, whatever the heck their versions were, and then they would see how those people's health was impacted. I don't know what they would measure as their response variable. Would they be looking at maybe blood pressure? Maybe they'd have them do some sort of other tests. But that's another thing to consider. It's like, okay, I want to know how impacts of salt. Well, that's easy enough. I know I'll just give people certain amounts of salt, and maybe I have like the recommendation from whatever the US group is that tells us how much stuff we should eat. USDA, drug and no, I have no idea. That group. But when you come up with something like this, and this is again going to come up in your research project, what the hell does health mean? How do I measure health? Is this a subjective? How healthy do you feel on a scale of 1 to 10? Or do you feel healthier than before? Or I feel more healthy, less healthy, the same? Or do I actually have something like hypertension where I'm looking at blood pressure? Or am I looking at weight gain? Or like how are we measuring health? So this is one thing that I'm going to say to you guys a lot when you guys come to me with your research questions is, that's great, but how are you measuring happiness? That's great, but how are you going to measure academic achievement? So keep that in mind. You need something you can actually measure, and it's fine to have a proxy for that. To say, okay, I can't really get health, but I'll get the subjective measure on health. So this exercise we did in class, in my traditional class, but we have not done in my hybrid class. I want a different color. This is our last piece for this first section. I know this video has gotten long. I'd like you to take a moment. I started this because this is a question I could ask on a test. I like critical thinking questions that are all about this sort of study design. Like, what questions would we ask? I want to see if we know how to do these, how to write questions that might be useful or meaningful. So I want you to take a moment, pause the video, and write some things that you would write as answers for this exercise. All right, coming back, I'm just going to give you some of the things that came up in my traditional class, as well as things I've had in the past. Most all of our phones have GPS nowadays, so looking at that GPS location of the phone. I know for me, it's like if I'm not at my house, the soccer field, or Mesa, it's pretty unusual. So if all of a sudden I'm not at any of those 3 places, that might be a tip-off that there's something suspicious going on. Who the calls are to and from, especially if they're international. I call like a total of 1 person. That's my husband. Sometimes my coworker when I have something to complain about. So if all of a sudden I'm calling numbers that I've never called before, that would be a big tip-off. Length or duration of calls, especially because, again, I don't call anyone. Even when my husband calls, I try to get him off the phone as fast as possible. We also had something like data usage. Right, all of a sudden I'm using more data than usual. Which apps are being used? If we had like lock screen attempts, if that's possible, I don't know if they can collect that, but maybe. I don't know, you keep going, right? There's no shortage of right answers here. And if this was a test question, I'd ask you to come up with probably 3, and there would be a large number of possibilities. So anyways, that concludes part 1, section 1. I'm sorry the video was so long. I'll try to chunk up the next ones a little bit more.